Day. In my program yesterday, a large part of the program, and indeed the first part of the program, was devoted to the three important pieces of news which had arisen, one in quick succession after the other, over the course of yesterday. The death of the Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, in a helicopter crash, the decision of the British High Court to grant Julian Assange permission to appeal, and the decision of the ICC prosecutor to seek arrest warrants of Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant of Israel, as well as of three as well as three Hamas officials. Well, today I'm going to go back to the topic of the war in Ukraine because, important as those other stories are, indeed very important as those other stories are, it still remains my view that it is the war in Ukraine that is the primary catalyst and the main driver of the colossal rearrangement that is taking place in international affairs. So, without further ado, I'm going to start today's program with another summary of the overall situation on the battlefronts. And again, it's important to say that the overall story is the same as it has now been continuously since the final defeat of Ukraine's counteroffensive in October. We are again seeing more Russian advances right across the front line, right across the entire line of combat. Now, it's important, in my opinion, to make two further observations about this. The Russian offensive has widened significantly in scope since October. In October and November, the Russians overwhelmingly were concentrating on Avdiivka, which of course they captured in February. But since then, the Russians have been much more active in every part of the front line. And it's a challenge for someone like me, both to keep up with all of these developments and to give any sort of blow-by-blow account of what is going on. There are, of course, others who do that very well, and I don't set myself up trying to do what they do, but of course it's also extremely difficult, at least I find it extremely difficult, to discuss or understand what is actually happening in a war if one does not discuss the war itself. Anyway, let's actually review the latest events on the battlefronts. I'm going to try and do it as briefly as possible, but when we are talking about a line of control that extends across hundreds of kilometers from the Black Sea all the way up to Kharkiv now, it's not entirely a straightforward thing to do. Let's start first of all with Kherson region. There were lots of reports over the last couple of weeks that the Ukrainians had established a foothold again in the village of Krinky, that they were planning some kind of major advance in Kherson direction, that they were going to transfer their naval infantry, their marine brigades, 4 of them, across the Dnieper River. There were reports that they were going to try to seize the mouth of the Dnieper, that they were going to launch attacks on the various promontories that the Russians control on the southeast bank of the Dnieper at its mouth. And as I said, there were also reports that they were going to return in force to Krinky, and there were even some claims that in fact it was not the case, that they'd ever really been pushed out of Krinky, supposedly, despite what Putin and Shoigu and the Russian Defense Ministry had said about Krinky a few months ago, that Krinky had been cleared of its Ukrainian presence. Allegedly, the Ukrainians in reality had always maintained a presence in Krinky. I should say, and I come back to what I've said before, I was on this topic before, I think some Russian commentators, or pro-Russian commentators, perhaps out of a desire to maintain balance, still place undue weight on some claims that Ukraine makes. So Ukrainians never acknowledged that they'd withdrawn from Krinky. They are denying, as I'm speaking, that the village of Belogorovka, which the Russian Defense Ministry says the Russian forces have completely captured, has indeed fallen under Russian control. They've made all kinds of claims at various times about all sorts of things. And as I said, there's a certain tendency to put these claims on the same weight, or to give these claims the same weight as the claims that the Russians, or at least the Russian Defense Ministry, makes. Now, I have to say this, following as I have the reports that the Russian Defense Ministry provides and comparing them with the reports that various agencies of the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian General Staff, President Zelensky himself, other Ukrainian official sources, comparing the two types of information, I've unequivocally come to the view that when there is a direct difference between what the Russian Defense Ministry is reporting and what Ukrainian officials are reporting, one should go with the Russian Defense Ministry. I'm not saying that because I have any inherent bias on this topic. I believe, as it happens, that the Russian Defense Ministry has not always told us the truth, but it has consistently proved to be more truthful and more reliable than the Ukrainians. On the specific topic of Belogorovka, for example, I am indisputably, at the moment, am placing much more weight on the Russian Defense Ministry's claim that Belogorovka has fallen than on the Ukrainian denials that it has done. But anyway, on Krinky, it's exactly the same. I think that if the Russians say that Krinky is back under their control, then unless I see convincing and compelling evidence that tells me otherwise, I'm going to go along with that. That does not, of course, exclude the possibility that from time to time the Ukrainians may send raiding parties and reconnaissance groups into Krinky for whatever reason they choose, but that is not the same as overall control. Anyway, the Russian military unit that is in control, or rather that is tasked with controlling the east bank of the Dnieper River in this particular area, the 76th Airborne Guards Division, by the way, one of the most elite units of the Russian Armed Forces, now has said that it is in complete and full control of Krinky and that there are no Ukrainian troops there. And I think we should take that as true. The 76th Airborne Guards Division also says that it is now tasked with clearing various islands in the Dnieper River of the presence of any Ukrainian troops that are there also. And I'm confident that that also is what is now going to happen. There were reports some days ago that the Ukrainian military has redeployed its forces, most of its forces from Kherson region, to Kharkiv to try to hold the line there. I'm not absolutely sure that is true, by the way. I've seen no evidence so far that the Marine brigades that used to be stationed in Kherson are now fighting in Kharkiv, but anyway, it does look as if Ukrainian defenses in Kherson region, or at least the Ukrainian military presence in Kherson region, is not as strong as had been suggested before. And I would quickly add that this appears to be the purpose of that mysterious, somewhat mysterious report that appeared in TASS on a couple of days ago, which spoke about some kind of Russian partisan unit operating Kherson city. As I said, I've never heard of such a unit before, but one which said that the entire Ukrainian force, which is occupying Kherson city, numbers no more than 2,000 men, and that at night it withdraws entirely from the metropolitan area of Kherson and deploys instead to the suburbs. So I think the purpose of that report was simply to tell us that there is not that big a presence of Ukrainian troops in Kherson any longer. Now, over the last couple of days, there have been lots of reports about Russian progress in the Zaporozhye and southern Donbass direction. So, a couple of days ago, the Russian Defense Ministry said that the important village of Rabotino, important that is to say, in terms of Ukraine's offensive of last year, the Ukrainians fought fiercely to try to capture that village. Now the Russians are fully back in control, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, and there are lots of reports that the Russians are now in this very same area, the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, that they're clearing the fields, pushing the Ukrainians out of their former fortifications, that the Russians, in other words, are reoccupying all the positions that they lost in Zaporozhye region over the period of Ukraine's offensive of last year. And presumably they will rebuild the fortifications, relay the minefields, do all of the things, put the frontline defenses, which, by the way, to repeat again, are not the main defenses of the Surovikin line. They are the defenses in the line of control. It looks as if the Russians are intent on re-establishing their defenses in this area. And they appear to be doing exactly the same in the Vremivka salient area. The Russian military there, which from the insignia of the units involved, are Russian naval infantry, marine brigades, appears to be now in control of a significant part of the village of Urozhaine, which the Ukrainians fought bitterly to capture over the course of their summer offensive. And the Russians also appear to be present in large parts of the village of Staromayorsk, which likewise the Ukrainians sought to capture last year and fought bitterly in order to capture. So it looks as if the Russians are working to regain control of all the territory that they ceded last year. And there's also been references made in Russian Defense Ministry updates to the village of Pyatikhatki, which lies to the west of Rabotino. It seems that there's some kind of fighting going on around Pyatikhatki as well, and I would suspect once more that the Russians intend in time to reoccupy that village. Now, all of this is leading me up to what I think is the next point, which is I think that the Russians, for the moment, are not actually planning a major advance north towards Zaporozhye and Orekhov. I think they're seeking to rebuild their defenses in all of these in Zaporozhye region to, as I say, reseed their minefields, re-establish their trenches, do all of that kind of thing. I think that if there is going to be a Russian offensive in this area, it is going to take the form of a landing operation on the west bank of the Dnieper River to retake the city of Kherson and the rest of Kherson region, and to re-establish the Russian positions close to Nikolaev, and to open the way, perhaps ultimately, for further advances either towards Krivoy Rog and Nikopol, important industrial cities on the north of the Dnieper, to the north of the Dnieper, opposite close to where the Zaporozhye nuclear power station is located, on the south bank, the Russian-controlled south bank of the Dnieper. Anyway, I think the Russians intend to return in force to these areas, and of course they intend to do that not because I think they actually intend for the moment a march on Odessa, but because they want to be positioned closer to Odessa to interfere, to be able to interdict more effectively Ukrainian missiles and drones and all of that are launched towards Crimea from Odessa and the areas around it. So I think that may be the Russian plan. Now, again, I want to stress the Russian Defense Ministry does not share its plans with me, but we've seen lots of telltale indications that this is so. We've seen that with the film of maneuvers in which it appears that Russian forces in Kherson region are rehearsing river crossings, and I think it makes logical sense in connection with all of the rest that is happening now along the battlefronts, with Ukraine overextended, with its forces weak, with the Russians having established an overwhelming superiority in the air. Now is the correct time to return to Kherson region, reoccupying Kherson city, re-establishing the bridgehead west of the Dnieper, which the Russians would want to exploit, and of course to sort out the problem of communications by establishing strong permanent pontoon bridges, probably several of them, which the Russian military can use to resolve its supply problems. Anyway, I'm going to start with that because that's my view. I think that is what is coming, probably not anytime very soon, but eventually at some point in the next few weeks and months. Now, what is going on elsewhere on the battlefronts? Well, there is a concerted move now by some people in the Western media, and I suspect that they've been encouraged to do this, to play down the significance of the Kharkiv offensive, to say that the Russians are failing in their primary objective, which was to seize the city of Kharkiv, or, as The Economist is now somewhat extraordinarily claiming, to surround and encircle the city of Kharkiv. This, even after all kinds of reports from all sorts of people over the last couple of days and weeks that the Russian forces deployed in Kharkiv region were too small, were too few to advance on Kharkiv, and even as President Putin himself has informed us that there is no plan to capture Kharkiv city for now. And anyway, I think this is a concerted thing. I think that I'm not saying that people have been put up to write these things, but I suspect they're being briefed that the operation has been a failure, the Russian operation has been a failure, simply because it's so important for Ukraine and its supporters to continue to preserve a positive spin as to the progress of the war, even as disasters pile up one upon the other. Anyway, what actually is happening in Kharkiv region? Firstly, there's lots of contradictory reports about what's going on in Lipsi. Some say that the fighting there is at a standstill, that both forces, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, have assembled large numbers of troops in Lipsi, which is almost certainly true, by the way, and that the Russians aren't advancing. And for their part, the Ukrainians have not been able to regain any lost ground, but that they're holding their positions. That may very well be true, but I would say that I'm also hearing all kinds of reports. Again, I can't verify them or corroborate them, and they do come exclusively from Russian sources, that despite the fact that resistance in Lipsi is indeed intense, and despite the fact that there are indeed many Ukrainian troops there, the Russians are indeed still making gradual incremental progress, that they're advancing on the flanks of this village and are gradually gaining more territory inside this village. Well, as I said, time will tell who is telling the truth about this. Straightforwardly, I don't know. But about Volchansk, I think here the situation is fairly clear. Firstly, despite some Ukrainian claims that they still have a presence amongst certain industrial buildings just north of the Volcha River, I think the convincing consensus is that the Russians now are in full control of the entire of the entirety of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River. Russian soldiers have been raising their flags, and we have pictures of them in various parts of Volchansk, of northern Volchansk, with their flags, and I don't think there's any real doubt about this. Now, there's also an accumulation of reports, and these are confirmed by Ukrainian sources as well, that the Russians have successfully crossed the Volcha River in at least two directions, and that fighting is now taking place inside southern Volchansk as well, and along the fields around it. And the general consensus, again, from those people who've been following the fighting most objectively, they might be on the Russian or on the Ukrainian side. They may have, as I do, their personal biases, but they seek to report facts as they see them, rather than spin them or make them different from what they are. Anyway, the reports from those who aim to report the fighting objectively is that the Russians appear to be making significant and, in fact, decisive progress in Volchansk, and though this is a sizable place with a population of something like 17,000 people before the war, it is only a question of time, perhaps a week, perhaps longer, before the whole of Volchansk finally falls under Russian control. And even as the Russians complete that part of their operation in Volchansk, their forces further south, also in Kharkiv region, around Kupiansk, are now increasingly active. And it seems that they've made further progress, advancing in the Kupiansk area towards other villages. Again, I'm finding it difficult to keep up with all of these different villages, but that the Russians anyway are continuing to regain ground in the direction of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. They have not, interestingly enough, reactivated their forces in the village of Sinkovka, which are very close to Kupiansk, but they seem to be making a concerted push to drive the Ukrainians back towards the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, to push them to the west bank of these two rivers, which are, by the way, relatively small rivers, and eventually to outflank Kupiansk from the south, even as with the imminent capture of Volchansk, they're preparing to make a move towards Volchansk from the north. And I've previously explained that it looks to me that just as I suspect the Russians eventually plan to regain all the territory they ceded west of the Dnieper in Kherson region, so the Russians appear to be aiming now to retake control of the territory that they lost to Ukraine over the course of the Kharkiv counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022. This will be a slow, grinding battle, but that, it seems to me, is what the Russians are doing. They've re-established their presence in Kharkiv region in the north, close to Kharkiv itself. Sooner or later, they will retake Lipsy. They're close to taking Volchansk. They will, at some point, also make their move towards Kupiansk. And no doubt, at some point also, they will cross the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, and they will retake, or aim to retake, the other towns like Izium, Balakleya, and Liman, which they ceded to Ukraine in the autumn 2022 counteroffensive, re-establishing a presence close to Kharkiv, obviously, but perhaps also close to Slavyansk, the northern city that forms part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, the last big urban agglomeration still under Ukrainian control in Donbass, the fall of which will signal the final end of the Battle of Donbass. So it seems to me that the Russians are aiming over the next few months, their objective over the next few months, again, I don't know what timeline, if any, they've given themselves, but their objective increasingly looks to me to bring themselves back in Kherson and Kharkiv region, back to where they were before Ukraine's costly counteroffensives of the autumn of 2022. And of course, it isn't just their objective to regain that ground that they had lost before, because they are also working to enlarge the territory in Donbass itself, going well beyond now the territories that they had captured and held before in 2014 and 2015 and in 2022. So they've already, of course, captured Bakhmut. They captured that last year. Then at the end of last year, they completed the capture of Marinka. Then in February of this year, they captured Avdiivka. Then in March, April, they captured Ocheretino. And now we're getting lots of reports in the Avdiivka-Ocheretino area that they're enlarging significantly their areas of control there. So we got reports yesterday, which appear to be confirmed, that the Russians have now cleared the fields between Arkhangelskoye and Novoalexandrovka to the northwest of Ocheretino, but that they're also now in the process of advancing towards the village of, well, actually it's a small town, of Alexandropil, east of the H20 highway, that they're taking under their control various villages in that direction, and that they are moving gradually forces towards the north, towards this other village to the north of Arkhangelskoye, the village, the village of Kalinove, which they would also need to capture in order to secure their advances west, north and west of Alexandropol, Pantelimonivka, and Valentinivka. Now, these battles to the east of Ocheretino and along the H20 highway connect with the fighting in Chasov Yar. And here we're getting a cascade of information over the last couple of days. The Russians have been launching attacks on the micro district east of the Seversky Donetsk Canal, the canal which bisects Chasov Yar. Zelensky, a couple of days ago, claimed that all of these Russian attacks had been unsuccessful, and again, various people assumed that was true. Except we now have lots of film and photographs from this area, which confirms that fighting in the micro district is indeed underway, and it appears to be of an extraordinary level of ferocity. The Ukrainians have moved many of their most determined fighters to the micro district, including the Kraken Special Forces Unit, but those troops appear to be essentially surrounded. There is no, the Russians control the crossing points between the micro district and Chasov Yar, the main part of Chasov Yar to the west of the canal. And though the fighting is incredibly intense, with extraordinarily heavy degrees of shelling of the micro-district by the Russian army, and with the Russian Air Force extremely active in this area, nonetheless it's clear that the fighting for the micro-district is indeed underway. The Russians are indeed storming it, and they appear to have captured a whole string of buildings. In fact, many buildings inside it. One report said that the Russians already control 30 to 40% of the micro district. That probably is, as of now, something of an overstatement. In my opinion, once again, the Ukrainians made some extremely strange decisions here. I would have thought that it was obvious that the Russians would eventually reach the canal. I thought it was also obvious that once, sooner or later, they would thereby be in a position to cut off the micro district. I would have thought that in light of that, it would be obvious to any Ukrainian commander that deploying some of Ukraine's best units, the Kraken force and units like that, to the micro district was merely a guarantee that those units would eventually be destroyed. But nonetheless, again, following the current pattern of decision-making in Ukraine, the one which has, by the way, persisted ever since the war began, the Ukrainians have done exactly that. They seem to have staked all on defending the micro-district, deploying their best forces to defend the micro-district, which will probably make it easier, by the way, when the Russians do capture the micro-district and move on to attack the rest of Chasov Yar, to take the rest of Chasov Yar. Anyway, intense fighting going on there, and there are now also what appear to be confirmed reports that the Russians are indeed in the village of Kalinina to the north of Chasov Yar, not far from Bogdanovka, which the Russians also captured some weeks ago. Kalinina lying astride the Seversky Donetsk Canal, and it looks as if the Russians are in the process of capturing Kalinina, which will enable them to cross the Seversky Donetsk Canal in the north, just as they're now well positioned to cross the Seversky Donetsk Canal in the south. And Lots of reports also from the Russians that further away, but in the places connected to this fighting in Chasov Yar, the Russians have now captured the bulk of Klashevka, this small village to the southwest of Bakhmut, which again the Ukrainians made a huge issue of seeking to recapture in the fighting last year, and that they are also close to recapturing the tiny hamlet of Andreevka, which lies somewhere to the south of Klashevka. Now, the Ukrainian troops here appear to be soon in a condition where they're going to be forced to withdraw west of the Seversky Donetsk Canal. I don't understand, again, why they have sought to defend Klashevka and Andreevka. I would have thought that following the fall of Ivanivska, another village just to the north of these two places, it made no sense any longer to hold on to Klashevka and Andreevka, but the Ukrainians nonetheless decided to make a fight of it and to sacrifice their best men, many of their best men, doing precisely that. Now, the argument I always receive from various people when I say that Ukraine is defending undefendable positions is that Ukraine has to do that in order to buy itself time to build up its reinforcements and re-equip its forces in the rear and to construct its various great defensive lines. Except the reality is that it is not the Ukrainians who gain by prolonging the fighting in places like Klashevka, Andreevka, the micro-district, or wherever. It is the Russians. It is the Russians who have chosen to fight a war of attrition. Everybody now concedes this. That wasn't always the case, by the way. It is the Russians who become stronger every day, and it is the Ukrainians who become weaker every day. So, fighting in undefendable places where you lose more of your best trained troops, of which you have relatively few in number, and where the enemy is increasing its number of trained troops every day, doesn't make any sense to me. And as for this argument that Ukraine needs time in order to build up its great fortified lines and defenses, well, we've seen over the last few weeks with the fighting in Kharkiv that more often than not, these great defense lines do not exist and cannot exist given the economic realities in Ukraine itself at this time. Anyway, the thing to say is that with the fighting in Chasov Yar intensifying, and with the Russians increasingly looking as if they're preparing to undertake a future advance up the H20 highway from the area of Avdiivka and Ocheretino, there is now a real risk of large numbers of Ukrainian troops being caught in a pincer movement by the Russians, pushing south from Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, and pushing north from Avdiivka and Ocheretino. You look at a map and look to find these places on a map of Ukraine, you can see that the distances are far from great, and that all of these places actually connect well with each other, and that they connect well with the major roads. It seems to me that this is the place where the main crisis that Ukraine is facing is developing. And of course, Ukraine, because it is redeploying reinforcements to Kharkiv and to Sumy region appears to be, for the moment at least, somewhat oblivious to this and is undertaking the wrong strategy in order to avert this crisis that is developing. Anyway, that's one area of the battlefront. Another area where we now clearly have an emerging crisis is the area in the south central Donbass, Krasnogorovka, Netailovo, ultimately Kurachovo, and of course the villages that lie immediately between Russian positions and Kurachovo, places like Georgievka, Maximilianovka, Paraskovievka, Konstantinovka. And the key to understand here is that if the Russians capture these places, then all Ukrainian defense positions in southern Donbass, including the town of Vuglidar, major fortified center, become undefendable as well. And the Russians continue to make progress in this area. I've already said that the Ukrainian forces in Krasnogorovka apparently have been pleading for permission to withdraw. They're complaining that they're not getting rational orders from Kiev and that they're not getting reinforcements or supplies from Kiev either. And it seems that forces further south, the 79th Brigade, which has had one of its battalions taken from it for redeployment to the Kharkiv region, and which has been trying to hold the Russians back in the Novomikhailivka, Paraskovievka, Konstantinovka area, that it is now complaining that the situation is becoming more and more difficult, that the Russians are now advancing in Paraskovievka and Konstantinovka, and that it lacks the forces to repel them, and that it too is not getting rational orders from Kiev, or at least orders that are related to the actual situation on the ground, and that they're not getting the supplies and reinforcements either that they need in order to hold out. And over the last couple of hours, we have now received confirmation from precisely this area that the Russians have now captured the village of Netailovo, which means that they have, in effect, broken the Ukrainian defense line from Netailovo to Umanske along another road, but that the Russians have also captured Netailovo. There's photos of Russian troops raising their flags in Netailovo. Just as, by the way, there were also photos of Russian troops raising their flags in Klishevka near Chasov Yar. Anyway, there are now pictures of the Russians raising their flag in Netailovo, and it looks as if, here again, Ukrainian forces are facing an operational crisis. The Russians are closing in on Kurachovo, and if they close in on Kurachovo, it will spell, finally, not just the collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in Vuglidar, but also the likely encirclement of Vuglidar and probably the creation of a cauldron around that town and the Ukrainian troops there. This, unless, again, the Ukrainians make the correct decision, which is to retreat. Well, there we are. That, it seems to me, is the overall summary of the situation on the battlefronts. We see that the Russians are pushing in various directions, but Putin has said that they are working to a plan. Shoigu has said the same, and all the evidence is that they are. They're developing the breakthrough that they've achieved in central Donbass, in the Avdiivka-Ocheretino area. They're now piling up the pressure on Chasov Yar, which is all but certain to fall over some point over the next few weeks. And in the meantime, they're making the preparations for further advances in the Kupiansk area, on the area of the Oskol and Jerebets rivers, in the area that will put them close to an attack on Slavyansk, and they look like they're preparing something similar in southern Donbass. And in my opinion, once all these battles have been undertaken and brought under control, a crossing of the Dnieper into Kherson region looks very likely. So, a terrible situation with Ukraine suffering enormous losses it cannot replace. The mobilization plan appears to have destroyed whatever was left of President Zelensky's popularity. As of today, he is purely president on the basis that Ukraine is in a state of martial law. He has not been elected to another term, so he remains president purely on the strength of his own decision to announce martial law in Ukraine. I don't think, as I said, that is going to change his position immediately, but of course it might lead to challenges before long. But anyway, an increasingly bad situation along the front lines. And one person is clearly starting to understand how bad the situation is becoming, and that is Zelensky himself. Now, The Economist has recently published an article which highlights the fact that Zelensky's term is ended. I wonder why exactly they've done that, by the way. But we also read in The Economist that Zelensky feels that he's not being told the whole truth about the situation near Kharkiv and is screaming at his generals. This is in The Economist. And we have a report from a Ukrainian officer, Denis Yaroslavsky, who says Zelensky's been kept in a warm bath. We believe that the president should focus on the situation on the ground and not imitate Putin, a man whose life revolves around the papers that his assistants bring to him, which is completely wrong about Putin, by the way. Putin makes a point repeatedly of meeting senior military commanders and visits the various command headquarters. But anyway, it's probably more true of Zelensky. Anyway, the key thing to say is the report about him screaming at his generals. And perhaps coincidentally, and I don't actually think that it is a coincidence, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has just made comments which seem to be consistent with this report of Zelensky retreating into screaming fits. And I presume he said this without knowledge of what The Economist was writing, but he's recently said this. These are Lavrov's words. We have information, we have the ability to receive information that is not usually intended for publication. At the end of April, while discussing his peace formula, Zelensky's peace formula, with foreign diplomats in Kiev, Zelensky, according to some participants, mostly improvised in a chaotic manner, almost hysterically demanding support for his peace formula as a means to force Russia to its knees. Now that's from Lavrov, and perhaps we shouldn't take that seriously. But The Economist is very sympathetic to Ukraine, to put it mildly, and it tells us that Zelensky has recently taken to screaming fits. And, well, I think we do need to take that seriously. Now, when people engage in things like that, It's a sign that they're frightened, that they're increasingly frightened, and that they're becoming increasingly aware that everything is falling apart around them. And I think Zelensky, who certainly, despite what that Ukrainian officer says about him being kept in a warm bath, who certainly has some knowledge of the situation, understands or has gradually come to realize how bad the situation for Ukraine now is. But he continues to be unwilling to make any move towards peace. For example, he recently rejected out of hand President Macron's idea of a truce during the Paris Olympics. The Russians must have been delighted, by the way, at Zelensky's rejection of this truce idea, because clearly they didn't want to agree to it themselves. Why would they, given that they've been all but excluded from the Paris Olympics? And why would they also, when they are the ones who are successfully conducting an offensive? But Zelensky, who you might think, in all the circumstances, would leap at a chance to have even a temporary respite for his forces, which a truce would provide. Anyway, he rejected it out of hand. So he's not prepared to take any step towards peace. He is not prepared to sit down realistically and discuss with the Russians or with anyone else a peace agreement that would take into account the realities that Ukraine finds itself in. And there are even reports that some people in the United States, in fact, those people in the United States, who for well over a year now have been sounding alarm bells about the conflict in Ukraine, have been suggesting that the way forward is to try to discuss with the Russians how some kind of peace in Ukraine might be achieved, even if it is only a freeze or an armistice. Anyway, it seems, I read a report that they have again come round to the view that Zelensky is a primary obstacle in achieving that objective. What they do about that, completely unclear to me. As I said in my program yesterday, after Zelensky was able to dismiss General Zaluzhny, it seems to me that his position in Kiev has consolidated and that it's going to be very difficult indeed to remove him from office, or even, given that the security services still apparently remain loyal to him, to remove him through some sort of coup attempt. I'm not saying it's impossible. It just looks to me extremely difficult. But anyway, there we are. Zelensky screaming, becoming hysterical, so we're told, and everything we know about the situation supports that conclusion. The miracle weapons that he's been promised by the West do eventually arrive. The ATACMS came, 100 of them allegedly. They've not achieved very much, as I discussed in my program yesterday. The attack on the Belbek air base has turned out to be less successful than it appeared. It seems that only that the two MiG-31s that were destroyed in the attack had for a very long time been non-operational and were on the runway idle for months without taking off, a clear sign that they are not actually operating aircraft. Anyway, the attack on the Belbek base, however, the one instance when an ATACMS can be reliably said to have penetrated the Russian defenses and done some damage, and the Ukrainians carried out another missile strike and drone strike on Crimea about a day or so ago. They claimed that they'd destroyed a Russian missile corvette and a minesweeper, but I've seen no evidence to support this, And overall, again, it looks to me as if that attack has failed. So the attacks with ATACMS missiles have been unsuccessful. The attacks with the Storm Shadows and the Scalps have been unsuccessful as well. The HIMARS, well, we no longer hear about what a success those were because they are that no longer. The small diameter bombs that have launched from the HIMARS launchers, they're being systematically jammed by the Russians. The other weapon systems, the tanks, the Abrams tanks, the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s have all failed on the battlefronts. And of course the F-16s have not yet arrived. But that whole project looks as if it's mired in problems, as many people predicted that it would be. And we don't yet know when they will arrive, and nobody thinks that they're going to make any convincing difference. So, very difficult situation. Zelensky understands all of this, but he's not prepared to find a way out through negotiations. And exactly as one might expect, he still clings to straws. He clutches at straws. The peace conference in Switzerland being the main one at the moment, and he seems to scream at people he no longer trusts and who perhaps give him the news he doesn't want to hear, be it in Kharkiv region or in the diplomatic arena. And I suspect that if there was a Zelensky tantrum over the course of this meeting with the ambassadors, and one would be interested to know how Lavrov got this information, but probably one of the countries has leaked the fact to him. Anyway, if there was a tantrum by Zelensky at this meeting with the ambassadors and the diplomatic representatives in April, it's probably because the peace conference itself in Switzerland is fading away. It looks as if more and more countries, more and more of the really important key countries, are staying away. China has made it clear that it is not intending to attend this peace conference. I'm not sure what the stance of India is, but some reports I've seen suggest that India perhaps will also stay away, though the usual practice of India is that they do attend any conference that they're invited to, so perhaps they will, in the end, come to this one. Brazil apparently is also staying away as well, and it looks as if South Africa has also decided that it too will not attend. In other words, the BRIC states collectively look like they're either boycotting this conference or playing down their participation in it. And it's clear that the purpose of this conference in Switzerland, the way it was originally set up by the Swiss, almost certainly in cooperation with the Western powers, which was to bring together most of the leading states in the world, get them to endorse, if only in its broad contours, Zelensky's so-called peace formula, a peace formula which, though set out in generalities, appears to be loaded with wording which would in effect require a total capitulation by the Russians if they were to accept it. Anyway, the idea seems to have been to try to forge at least the appearance of an international consensus around this Zelensky peace formula, doing so at a conference which the Russians themselves would not be present at, but to which the Russians would then be invited and at which they would be presented with what was supposed to be the international consensus behind Zelensky's formula. with a request that the Russians comply with the Zelensky formula, couched in effect in terms that would amount to a demand. The Russians say an ultimatum. Well, the Russians refused to have anything to do with the Swiss peace conference. They made it very clear that they were not prepared to attend any part of it, certainly not the discussions if they were not, well, they were not invited to the discussions, but certainly they were not prepared to attend, simply to be handed over a document of that nature. The fact that they've stayed away and have made very clear their feelings about the peace conference appears to have decided all of the other BRICS states, or at least the most important BRICS states, to stay away as well. And recently, I think it was Chancellor Scholz of Germany, started to play down what could be expected from the peace conference. He's been saying that it can only deal with some of the more peripheral issues in the conflict, humanitarian aid, that kind of thing, but that it won't provide a diplomatic breakthrough. The international consensus for that simply does not exist. And I suspect that this is what Zelensky was told at this meeting in April, and perhaps some of the delegations tried to get him to understand that in order to get the peace conference underway and to persuade more countries to attend and to take a meaningful role in the peace conference, he needed to agree to some sort of concessions, or even make the appearance, give the appearance that he was prepared to contemplate some concessions, maybe on territories or Ukraine's status. And of course, Zelensky didn't want to hear this, and that's why he burst into a tantrum, creating what Lavrov says was a chaotic meeting, mostly improvised in a chaotic manner, almost hysterically demanding support for his peace formula as a means to force Russia to its knees. As I said, I suspect that this is what happened. But anyway, there it is. He is running out of road, and I think he knows this. I think he knows that Ukraine is running out of road, and I think he knows that he himself is running out of road also. But he can't get off the car, and he can't apply the brake. And for the moment at least, it seems as if no Western government is prepared to do this either. I've heard reports that finally, in some European countries, I don't want to say which ones, because again, that might identify the person who's given me this information. Anyway, in some European countries, and I'm talking here about core members of the NATO and EU system, that in some European countries, some top officials, by which I mean actual ministers, are now becoming increasingly concerned about the direction of the war and want to find some way to get off what they increasingly see as a runaway train. But they continue to be intimidated by the others within these governments, and that for the moment at least, they are not prepared to speak out. So, the runaway train, presumably with Zelensky as the driver, continues to trundle forward, or if you prefer, the bus with Zelensky as the driver trundles forward at accelerating speed, even as the road runs out. So what else is going on? Well, the Financial Times recently published a long article which essentially confirmed the analysis that we had made in the Duran, that the latest plan is to somehow Trump-proof aid for Ukraine by providing money to Ukraine secured in the form of loans against Russian assets. Except it seems it won't be the assets themselves, it will be the proceeds from the assets, the interest, which will only provide around 3 billion euros or dollars, as I understand it, a year, which doesn't look like being anywhere near enough. But there's a long article about this in the Financial Times, and yesterday in the print editions, it was the headline story. G7 warms to plan for Trump-proofing Ukraine aid. Washington seeks to front-load aid for Ukraine by using profits from Russian frozen assets as loan guarantees. It is completely illegal. Even the European Central Bank is apparently very unhappy with this idea. But the pressure is enormous, and it looks like that is what's going to happen. So we're going to see the profits, the interest from the frozen assets used in order to keep funding for Ukraine ongoing indefinitely, whatever happens in the election in November. Of course, how that changes the battlefield situation in Ukraine, the Financial Times article doesn't say. It doesn't say because it can't. But anyway, there we are. Because it can't and it won't. But there we are. That is the plan. We said that this would be the plan in programs that we did on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I. And here it is. It's all laid out fully and elegantly, if I can put it like that, in a long article in the Financial Times. So, all of that. And whilst I'm on the topic of European reactions, there has been an outstanding article on new capitalism about the assassination of assassination attempt on Robert Fico, which discusses the atmosphere in which that assassination took place and makes many good points about the way in which Robert Fico had been handled by the media, the European media, in advance of that assassination, and how when in other matters it's been accepted that the atmosphere prior to acts of violence contributes to those acts of violence, but that nobody is saying that. No European official is saying that. No Western government is saying that in connection with the attack on Robert Fico. The article, by the way, its title is Assassination Attempt on Slovak MP, highlights dangers of constant EU demonization of Project Ukraine opponents. And it is by Conor Gallagher. There is, by the way, also, since I referenced naked capitalism, a fine article by Eve Smith pointing out that one of the reasons why the president in the United States is behind in the opinion polls, it's because despite claims to the contrary, despite claims of an economic boom in the United States, the reality is that over the last couple of years in the United States, there has been a significant fall in real wages. Two good articles there. Elsewhere, there's been yet another interesting article in the Financial Times about the massive embarrassment that the decision of the International Criminal Court, or rather the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has caused to the United States by his request to the International Criminal Court for arrest warrants against top Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the article says that this request from the chief prosecutor has sparked great anger in the United States across the political class, but that it's also put Washington in a bind because they insisted, or rather they strongly supported, I've actually heard that they lobbied for the arrest warrant against President Putin, which was announced about a year ago, despite the, I would have said, overwhelming jurisdictional obstacles the ICC faced in issuing that warrant. And now, having fiercely supported the issue of that warrant, they now find that the ICC is escaping their control and is issuing warrants which the US doesn't want against Israeli leaders. Well, again, those who have been following the news closely, the information closely from the Middle East, have been watching the developments as they've been playing out across the world, can see how this would happen. And it's, again, astonishing that the United States, through the ICC, has lobbied for decisions which create precedents, which ultimately backfire upon itself. This is what has obviously happened in this case. Anyway, there we are. A situation in this war, in this conflict in Ukraine, that deteriorates, that is deteriorating, and which is continuing to get worse. The Diva at the Military Summary Channel said in his program yesterday, one of his two programs yesterday, that the situation, Ukraine's situation, is getting worse, that Russian advances along the contact line are accelerating, that the position of Ukraine is deteriorating, and I have to say I agree. I too think that the situation is deteriorating faster and faster. You have to be following events close up to see the extent to which this is so, and to see the extent to which the deterioration is now taking place along the entire combat line. I'm not sure how long this process can continue for, but I doubt that it can continue for as long as some people think. Let's talk about the war continuing up to 2026. Others say 2025. I suspect it will end, or at least it will reach its culmination, its crisis point, significantly sooner than this. I'm not going to try and guess when. Zelensky's recent behavior points in the same way. He's screaming at the generals. He's having tantrums in front of the diplomats. I have no doubt that the story in The Economist is true, and I believe Lavrov's account. There we are. Anger, hysteria, panic, fear. I spoke about panic. I've discussed panic in various programs. Of course, screaming fits and tantrums are a classic sign of panic. And in Kiev, definitely, it's taken hold. and before long it will reach its apogee in Western capitals also. Thank you for joining me again for this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. Please also remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by checking and also don't forget to check out our shop where you can buy all sorts of amazing things. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not least, please remember to tick the likes button and check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day. See you soon.